Welcome everybody as we're starting on YouTube. We hope everyone has had a good week. Welcome to those people who are on Zoom. Welcome to people who are here in person in the class, and welcome to the throngs of people online on YouTube. We hope everyone's doing well. This is the second part series in the history of Judaism. Last week we studied biblical Judaism and the history of our people in the Bible times. It's a little easier sometimes because it's kind of a direct link. We do leave for a while, but we come back. So we're always in Israel, even though we're in other places. When you go to the post-biblical era, it gets to be a little bit more difficult because you're dealing with the entire world. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about the power in the Jewish world. Where did the power go? So we know what the power of the Jewish world is in, at first, Israel. Kind of leaves for a little bit during the exile when we're in Babylon. Then we come back to Israel, and it's in Israel. There's still a group of people who are Jews, and of course Babylon this whole time. But the power really stays in Israel for the most part of our first 12 to 1300 years of existence. And that's pretty good run. However, we know things change, and that's exactly what happens. So when we last left, we talked about the destruction of the temple, the one built first by Solomon, and then that was destroyed, then was rebuilt by the Jews returning from exile. That was around for hundreds of years. And then during the end of the first century, sort of, CE, that's the modern era, we had a rebellion in Israel starting in 67. First Vespasian, then Titus came, and they destroyed the rebellion, and the temple was destroyed circa the year 70. In case you're wondering about the Dead Sea Scrolls, that group of people were the Essenes living in the desert, and what happened to Masada would come later as well. But we still had most of the Jewish power in the world living in Israel. Circa zero, there are Jews living all around the Mediterranean. We know from archives we have a Jewish community living in Egypt, in several places, a very prominent Jewish community. You have Jewish community living in other places around the Mediterranean, even in Rome. So there are Jews living all over, but really the main section of Jews live in Israel. After the destruction of the temple, the Bible is codified in Israel, circa 90 CE, and we live in Israel under Roman dominion continually. Jews are not allowed in Jerusalem, but we're still living there. And then there are two more rebellions. And the major one is the Bar Kokhba rebellion that happens in 132-ish. Bar Kokhba, who many thought was the Messiah, certainly Rabbi Akiva, the greatest rabbi of the age, thought so, led this rebellion against Rome. And unfortunately, all three wars, as I mentioned last week, we did really well. We really took it to the Romans. And that is problematic because if you lose quickly, the repercussions are probably not as dire as if you really give them competition. And that's what we did. They had to bring legions away from their war with the Parthians, and they did not want to bring them here into the middle of nowhere, which is what Israel was in the ancient world. So when they finally defeated Bar Kokhba, Rome just killed everybody they could find, as many scholars. They set the country on fire, and the country really didn't recover until the 20th century when the Jewish world and had members move there and really make an oasis out of what's Israel, because it was basically just desert and swamp for a very long time. And so Jews still remain, though, in this area in Israel in the 2nd century CE. And it's not the best time for Jews in this area, but it's not the worst in terms of religiously, because the Roman Empire has instilled, created Catholicism as its central religion. That's going to be over the next couple of hundred years. So it wasn't religiously that Rome was upset at us. It was because of the rebellion. So what happens in Israel is around 200 CE, a wonderful sage named Judah Hanasi, Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, takes all of these post-biblical discussions and he puts them together and creates something called the Mishnah, the second teaching, which is supposed to really teach you about how to live your life. And it's probably the capstone for the end of the age in which Israel is the center of the world. Because what's going to happen is in the 3rd century, we're going to see the power base of the Jewish world move somewhere else. We already have Jews living in the Babylon, Persian area, all the way going back 700 or 800 years. It's now under the control first of the Parthians, then it's going to be the Sassanids. We have Jews living, as we said, in Egypt and other places. But what we're going to see is this power move somewhere else. So as we go through, I'm going to be putting different maps and so forth up here so that you can see what is going on in the world. And what I'm putting up here now is a map of the Sassanid Empire. That's going to be so important to our world. So the Sassanid Empire or the Persian Empire, you can see on this map, the purple is the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. This is, of course, a later map. And then, of course, you're going to see the Persian Empire, the Sassanid dynasty. That's actually going to get even bigger than this. But they spend a lot of time competing with the Romans. And they control, as you can see, a large area of what is Iraq, Iran, part of Afghanistan, part of Turkey, part of Syria. And it's a very big empire. And this is where we're going to see the power base move from Israel. There's always going to be Jews in Israel. There are going to be Jews in Israel from the time of post-Moses to later. But this is the end of Israel being the center of the Jewish universe alone. In other words, what we're going to see is the money, the intelligence, the scholars are going to be moving somewhere else because it's a very difficult area to live. First of all, it's the middle of nowhere. Second of all, it's just been destroyed by Rome, who could care less about it. Third, you have an empire nearby where Jews have been living in that area for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you're going to end up with an empire that is very supportive of the Jewish community. So if you ask who started this change in power, it would be 2 rabbis, one named Rav, one named Shmuel, or Samuel. They're the first generation of what we call the Amorim, the people who started writing what we would call the Talmud. And so they study in Israel under Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince. But Rav is from what is the Sassanid Empire, was the Parthian Empire. And so he and Shmuel go back to Babylon and they start academies. Samuel starts one in Nehardea. After he dies, it's going to be moved to Pumbedita. And Rav starts his in Sura. And these 2 academies are started in kind of the middle of, not the center of the world, but what's going to be important is what's going to happen next. Because what will happen is eventually, basically the center of this world, of the Sassanid world, is going to be in this area. And that's going to be essential. I'm going to put up a map of exactly where these wonderful seminaries are going to be. Again, these are basically going to be the center of the Jewish world in terms of the intelligence, in terms of what we are creating for the rest of the world. So if you look here on this map, you'll see that Pumbedita and Sur right here, where the rivers right before the Tigris and Euphrates meet. And right around that area is where we're going to find the Sassanid capital is going to be. And Sur and Pumbedita, these two academies, these major academies, happen to be near the center of the Sassanid world. And that is going to be very important because they're close to what is the center of one of the centers of the universe. Obviously, the Roman Empire is the largest, but there are other powerful empires, and this is one of them. So these academies are going to be right smack near where they need to be, where you're going to have people moving, you're going to have industry, you're going to have everything going on, like New York City or Washington or Tel Aviv or London. This is the center, or one of the centers of the world. And you can take a piece right there. There's a map, should be a map right here on my desk. Perfect. So this is one of the centers of the world, right near the Tigris and Euphrates, where Iraq is, obviously, so they have water, which is essential. It's right where the wheel was created. And what they're going to do is they're going to be very successful, both religiously and politically, but also economically. And it's going to be a boon because the Sassanids are very supportive of the Jewish community for several reasons. One, we're not Christian, and eventually the Roman world is going to become more Christian, which is a threat. So we'll see the same thing with the Muslim world. You don't want to give too much power to people in your country who have a religion that have adherence to a religious leader somewhere else. So that's one of the reasons. Jews also had a lot of similarity in many ways religiously to Zoroastrianism, which was created a little bit after Judaism, but is the Sasanian religion, which had a dichotomy, kind of a heaven and hell, which was a little different than us, but had a lot of similarities in terms of ethics and being literate and really considering the importance of religion in everyday life. And so they allowed these two academies to flourish. They had secular leaders who were Jewish and religious leaders, and both were doing very well. In terms of religiously, this is where the great sages of the 200s, 300s, and 400s, and 500s, 600s, 700s, 800s come to live to study. This is where it's all happening. It's like the coffee shops in France or the seminary, great seminaries throughout history. This is where people came. If you wanted to be learned in the Jewish world, this is where you went. We call them now yeshivot, seminaries, but there were many of them, but two major ones were in Sura and Pumbedita. And people would come from all over to study in this area. And this, of course, is where the Talmud is written and codified. Now, in case you're wondering, there are two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. However, you would think the Jerusalem Talmud would be more important, but it is not. It's the Babylonian Talmud, which is considered the more important. They're both important, obviously, they're Talmuds. But the Babylonian is the one. When you see everyone studying all the time, Reform, conservative, Orthodox Jews, they study mostly the Babylonian Talmud. It takes longer. The greater sages are in Babylon, and it is finished sometime in the 500s, probably completely codified 100 years later. And so this is one of the great achievements in the Jewish world, the Talmud. It is the basis in many ways for religion. Certainly the Bible is, but they take the Bible and into the Talmud and create study. It's where we learn to discuss with each other. It's where we argue. And in this area, the exilarch was kind of the head of the Jewish community. They even gave a name to a head who was the official head. The marcation was given by the Sassanids, although he was chosen often by the Jewish community. He was the one in charge of ensuring that everybody paid their taxes and that everybody followed all the laws. So the power base, which had been for so long in Israel, firmly is now in what we would call Mesopotamia. It was ruled by different entities throughout the age, but at this time, the Persian kings that are called the Sassanids are very supportive. They're almost like second-class citizens, but very essential citizens. So they have a higher level of connection to the leadership than those who are not of this religion. And this was true in every area of life. And we know a lot about life there, but we know more, of course, about it through the Talmud. And this is really an incredible feat. So congratulations to Babylon, because this is where the Talmud is going to be written. In the 7th and 8th century, the leaders are going to be called the Gaonim. This is a family that goes through hundreds of years. Saadia Gaon is the most famous, and they in the 8th century, 9th century are going to codify a lot of the things we have today. The prayer book, laws on kashrut, wearing yarmulkes, one spouse. All of these things after the Talmud are still done in this area by the Gaonim. And don't think all the Jews are always getting along, because there's a separate group called the Karaite, who are Jews who believe only in the Bible but are not so supportive of this new thing they call the Talmud, are going to be in that area competing with the Gaons. You're going to have those who support the Talmud and those who don't. Both are Jewish sects, and as you can guess, the one that is not the Karaite wins out. There's still Karaites, a few of them left, but the power is so incredibly focused in this area that the two greatest powers of the age are Jews in that same area. It's not like Babylon's competing with Israel to be the center of the Jewish world anymore. Babylon is competing with itself. They have Karaites, the Gaonim, and for generations they will compete with each other to be the leaders in the leadership area. Now, this is under the Sassanid Empire, which of course is a great empire. We give it 2 thumbs up, very supportive of the Jewish world. However, as with all things, they do not exist. The empire can be given the time period from 224 often, where the Sassanians overthrow the Parthians, but eventually, obviously, they're going to be overthrown in the 7th century by various entities, but especially the Muslims. So the Muslim world is going to eventually take over this with the caliphate. And it's really a quick end to this empire. The empire is fighting with Romans and with others, and East Rome will deal a decisive blow to the Sassanians. However, it is not them that really take over the empire. As we're going to look at this map, we're going to see how much bigger this area is, because we're going to see the caliphate, which is the Muslim world when it begins, is enormous. I'm going to show you the picture of it now. So the Muslim religion is unlike anything we've ever seen before in terms of world politics. It is one of the few times in history where a new entity ends up being in power quickly. You know, when we founded Judaism in the 13th or 12th century, we had to fight and claw our ways for centuries Christianity started out as a small religion, fought for centuries within the Roman world before it actually took over the Roman world. Islam is very different. It starts in Medina and Mecca, of course, and very quickly it has taken over a very significant portion of the world within years, not hundreds of years, not tens of years, within years. And what we see is once they take over Arabia, Babylon, they go to North Africa, they encroach on the Byzantine Empire. You can see from this map, they control quite a bit. All of Arabia, all the Middle East, all of North Africa. Eventually they will take, this is a little later, they'll take Spain. Of course, the center is going to be in what is today Syria, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, hinging on India. They go all the way up to the middle of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And they take control and really almost take over all of Europe. There's periods where it seems like they may take over Europe. It is a very powerful entity, started in the desert, but just really takes over as all these other areas are looking for a more modern religion for this day. So you can see here, it also takes over Israel and obviously Egypt. So the caliphate, which is under control of one person for a while, takes over, and you would think, according to today's world, that would be a problem. There seems to be issues between Jews and Muslims. They say, oh, Jews and Muslims have not gotten along for thousands of years. They've been fighting with each other. That is completely untrue. Could not be further from the truth, as a matter of fact, because the Muslim world was even more supportive of the Jewish world at this time than the Sassanids had. I mean, it was really incredible on several levels. One, the Muslim world is going to quickly become the most educated world. They are going to supplant Europe, Africa, China, although China will stay on board, as the most educated society in the world. As the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire ends, the Byzantine Empire is struggling at a time when people don't take baths because they think evil spirits will take them over, at a time where people believe literacy is terrible and only certain small sects of people can study and only the Bible. The Islamic world is blooming in ways we have not seen in that area even. I mean, they take education to the next level. Science, literature, philosophy, they are the heir apparents to the Greeks. And they are the ones who take Greek culture and then help bring it into their empire. And remember, in Europe, this is when you're not allowed to read. There are ghosts everywhere. This is a time period they call the Dark Ages. But in the Muslim world, it's the opposite. They are flourishing. They go to the top faster than anybody, not only in the incredible amounts of area they take over, but in terms of how intellectual they began. And this is the Jewish world's lottery ticket, because we're already there. We already have our major academies there. There's already a large Jewish community there. It's already the center of the Jewish world. And now this area becomes even more prominent. And not only that, similarly to what we saw, probably even more so, in the Muslim world, they consider the Bible a holy book. It is supplanted by the Quran, but they believe Moses and Jesus to be prophets. Obviously, Muhammad is their greatest prophet, but Moses and Jesus are still prophets. And as people of the book, there are certain measures of respect given to these groups at this time. Now, you would think that if I told you we were official second-class citizens, you'd say, well, that's a negative. That's terrible, because we know the connotations of second-class citizens today and what it means to be a second-class citizen. It's a terrible thing in America. In the Muslim world at this time, it is not. It is a wonderful thing, because obviously only Muslims can be the top level, but they have a special place for those who are people of the book, and they call them dhimmi, or second-class citizens. I always mispronounce the word. It's dhimmi. And it is an honor. It means you have a special status. It's not as high as a Muslim, but it can be very high depending on who's in charge. Muslims loved educated people, and we were some of the most educated people in the world. Muslims, as we saw from the map, and I'll go back to the map real quick. As we saw from the map, I did give the map. Here we go. As we see from this map, and I'll go back to it again, who were they always fighting? We read it all through literature. It's all the time. They're fighting people in Europe, the countries in Europe, and the Byzantine Empire. Because and they're always fighting. It seems like it's all, obviously it's not always, but often. And so it's the same issue the Christians had in the Sassanid world, Sasanian Empire. You don't want to give too much power to people who have an allegiance religiously somewhere else. And obviously, we didn't, because one, the center of our world was in this area. Two, the caliphate controlled Israel. So we were not a threat, and we're also much smaller in number. Much smaller. And so we were not a threat. So this is why the Gaonim, Sadia Gaon, after the end of the Sassanids, was able, and the Gaons were able to do so much in this world because of this really, truly fortuitous moment in time where we were in the right place at the right time. It doesn't always happen, and often it hasn't happened for us, but in this case it did. The right empire took over for the previous empire. We had our rights. They were even increased in many ways. And so the power base will stay in this area for many, many years. So we've seen the power base go from Israel to a short time in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. Then it kind of maneuvers a little bit in Israel. Then it stays in Israel until the 200s, where it will go into Mesopotamia. The Sassanians will be there, and then the Muslims. And our empire will be, that empire there will help ensure that the Jewish world is stable. And we will. We write the Talmud, we do all these other things. So the question is now, where do we go? Where does the power go after our time in the caliphate? Because the caliphate's going to remain for a very long time. And the answer is very simple. And it's an answer you all probably know, or you may know. Or if you don't know for sure, you probably know when I tell you. The answer is going to be Spain. We've all heard of the Golden Age of Spain. This is where it comes in. It's a very small map. You can see this is Spain. Now, Spain wasn't controlled always by one kingdom. It had been divided many times. You see a map here. The red is Christian world. The darker, I don't know, that's a dark aqua, a dark teal, green, I don't know whatever that color is. That's the Muslim world. Now, what do you mean it's the Muslim world? We're already in the Muslim world. That is true. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a divide in the Muslim empire. And the one caliphate is going to be overthrown, and goes the Umayyads that had been the first caliphate are kind of overthrown. They end up going to Spain, and Abbasids stay in control of what, of course, is the caliphate in Mesopotamia. So when the caliphate goes to Spain and Muslim rule starts there, and now Muslims have been there for a long time, but really by the time the Muslims take it over, we're talking about the 7th, 8th century, 9th century CE. You have the Berber Muslims coming in from Africa first. You have the other Muslims coming in from Babylon, and they end up taking over Spain. And many of the Jews go with them because we had skills and we felt that might be a good place for us. And so the power base had been Israel, a little bit of Babylon, then Babylon. It ends up being that Spain is even better for the Jewish community than the previous caliphate had been. This new caliphate is incredible for us. They bring Jewish scholars in this caliphate. We are still second-class citizens, but it's really, again, when you say second-class citizens, you can mean a lot of things. I can mean you're second-class citizen, you get my trash because you're a second-class citizen. Or in the case of Spain, second-class citizen means every major leader's right-hand person is somebody Jewish. Our skills were so much, and they really allowed the Jewish community to do quite a bit. For a couple hundred years, it was the best time probably in Jewish history up until probably America. That's why they call it the Golden Age of Spain, because it was not only religious areas, but it was philosophical areas. It was in science. You had famous Jews like Yehuda Halevi, who was one of the great poets of the age. And you see that in every place you go throughout Muslim Spain, remember, Christians own part of it and will be encroaching, that the Jewish world is doing really well. And one of the ironies, of course, is that the problems we face in Spain during this incredible time is because of the Christian world, which is quite an irony today because most Jews live in what we call the Western world and Christian societies that are so lenient and supportive of us. This is the opposite of what's going on back then. The Muslim world is much more supportive. In fact, if the Christian world had never encroached in Spain, we would have done fabulously well forever, probably. That's just, but as we know, that is not going to be the case. In the Christian world, they're starting to come out of the Dark Ages, but Jews in that world are not doing very well. And it begins in many respects in the 11th century. Now, we talk about anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism we think of today is not from 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It's about 1,000 years ago. The anti-Semitism we have today comes from the 11th century, mostly in Europe, and with a variety of things. We have the famines are because of Jews. These issues are because of Jews, and it really starts to get worse and worse, and it comes to a headway with, of course, the end of the 11th century, and we see in the Christian world, what do they start? They start these eventual conquests that go throughout Europe and, of course, in Jerusalem. Now, how it begins is really important because it teaches us a little bit that everything is not always hatred. When the First Crusade starts, there's already, the blood libel's already around maybe, we don't know for sure. There's already a lot of anti-Semitism, but it's getting sparked more and more. And one of the reasons is Europe has some issues. One of them is the eldest son gets everything. So if you have 4 sons, one son gets to inherit everything, the other son becomes a priest, and then the other sons have nothing to do. And you had a lot of this going on, and they needed scapegoats. And one of the scapegoats was the Muslim Empire as well as the Jews. The Muslim Empire was terrible. We need to go and take back the Muslim Empire and take back Jerusalem for ourselves. And this is the mentality because the Muslims were the enemies. And as good as the Muslims were in terms of technology, in terms of literature and education and philosophy, and as bad as the Christian world was at all of those things at this time, the Christian world was just as good, maybe even better at one thing, and that was war. They were very good with war machines. And this antagonism towards the Muslims and the Jews led them not only to go into Israel, but to continue to push southward into Spain. And as time goes on, they take this is over hundreds of years, they take areas after areas until, of course, in 1492, they complete it. Ferdinand and Isabella marry. That unites all of Spain together. That's when they kick the Jewish community out. But before this happens, the Muslim Caliphate is fighting off the Christian world there. And one of the issues is when the Muslim armies in Spain are not enough to push out the Christians coming south, they bring in marauders from North Africa. They bring in Muslims from North Africa who are very good fighters. Mamelukes are called. They come in, they help keep the Christians at bay, but these North African Muslims are not as supportive of the Jewish community as the Caliphate is. And they take over for a while. So this is in the 12th century. So in the 12th century, you see things start to sour in many ways for the Jews because these new Muslims are not as supportive of them, to say the least. The most famous Jew of the age, of course, is Maimonides, who's born in Spain, but flees first to Israel, then to Egypt to escape not the Christian hordes, but the new Muslim who have taken over. And what we're going to see now, though, is they eventually will be taken out and the new Muslim leaders will be more supportive. But as time goes on, the Christian armies encroach more and more and more until finally they take over Spain completely, take over, of course, Portugal, and we know what happens. So we see when this happens, we have the famous expulsion from Spain. And what I'm going to show you is this map of that. This is the expulsion out of Spain. Oops, the wrong map. I can find the right map. Let's see here. There it is. So as we look at this map, we see that it was not unusual for Jews to be kicked out of places. I don't know if that's unfortunate or not, but it usually is. If you look at this map, you can see where we've been kicked out of. And you'll notice in this time period, we're not kicked out of the Muslim empires at all. You don't see any arrows going out of the Ottoman Empire, out of Egypt, out of North Africa. You see the arrows pointing to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, because the arrows are coming from mostly Europe. And unfortunately, it's Christian Europe. Obviously, today it's very different in the Christian world. But you see 1492, we're kicked out of Spain. Years later, 1496, 1497, kicked out of Portugal. We had been kicked out of England in 1290, weren't allowed back in until the 17th century. Kicked out several times in France in the 12th century, but it really hit in the 14th century. And we kicked out of all the best places. So as you can see, the idea that Jews have been fighting with Muslims for thousands of years. First of all, the Muslims have not been here. The religion is not that old. But secondly, it's really only in the last 100 years or so that really there's been issues, and really only in the last 50 or 60 that it's been increasing. Generally speaking, until fairly recently, it was better to live in the Muslim world as a Jew than in the Christian world. So, what happens now? Oops, I erased the map. What happens? Where do we go? What do we do? We've been kicked out of Spain, which is the center point where most of the Jews are living, or a high percentage of them are living. I don't know how I got a double map here. Let's see how if I can fix this. There we go. So what do they do? So some of the Jews, as you can see from the lines, we'll go to Italy a little bit, but we're going to be kicked out of there soon after. One of the lines goes to the Ottoman Empire, to where a lot of us go. Some of us will go west, a small portion to America. Some of us will go south to, of course, North Africa. You see this very important line from Portugal going to the Netherlands. That's a very important line because there will be a very prominent Jewish community that will pop up in the Netherlands, probably one of the most prominent in Europe for many years. Now, throughout this time, there are Jews living in Europe. There's a very promising population in France until the 14th century, people like Rashi. But where does the power go in the Jewish world? And I think it's an answer we all know. Where do almost all Jews in America come from? If you were family is Jewish going back four generations, almost surely they're coming from Eastern Europe. That's where the power base is going to move to. Now, it is going to be a very different power base in this area of the world. Very different for a couple reasons. But first, let's figure out, how did we get there? So how did so many Jews get to this area? How many Jews? At one point, there's a belief that maybe 80% of all Jews lived in Poland. That's how big of a number. Millions upon millions. Now, if you look at this line, you see leaving Hungary, leaving Austria, leaving Crimea, going there. But what you notice is it doesn't seem that many people are leaving. If you're coming from Hungary and Austria and Silesia in Germany, I mean, that's a number of people, but that's not millions upon millions. That's not the majority of the Jewish world. So how do we get to Poland? And the answer is, we know. We know how we get to Poland. We're invited. Poland needed people with skills, and they weren't all connected. So various leaders, kings or dukes, invited Jews because we had skills. And we invited us in the 12th century and the 13th century, and we moved there for freedom of worship, freedom of assembly. We could even own land in some cases. And it really was we think of Poland as always being a terrible place, but it wasn't. It was not a bad place. When we first moved there, especially for those who were in Spain or those who were having troubles, by the mid-16th century, 80% of world Jews lived in Poland and were not doing too poorly. Often they were thriving. They had an official Polish rabbi. They were given a lot of autonomy. They raised money for their own causes, for other causes. There were Talmudic scholars, the most famous, Moses ben Israel Sisraelis, who helped create one of the most important documents in our history, the Shulchan Aruch. It was not a bad place for Jews to go because, again, they needed us for our skills. Now, was it always good? No, of course not. We had problems when the Black Death hit. They blamed us. We were easy scapegoats because obviously those scapegoat rumors and stories all had come from Western Europe had then moved that way. But it wasn't a bad place for hundreds of years. Now, the question many of you may have is, okay, we know some Jews went there from these different places. How did so many Jews, how did it end up being that 80% of the entire Jewish world lived in Poland? And the answer is very interesting. The answer is we have absolutely no idea. We don't know how millions upon millions of Jews ended up there. The numbers are just too big for us to understand. Were people having 20 kids? Were couples having 20 kids, and then when one dies, they have 20 more with their next spouse? Possibly. We know a lot of the Jews from Italy moved there. And when you think of Sephardic and Ashkenazic, this is when it starts. Sephardic and Ashkenazic is not from 4,000 years ago. It's from this period when we're starting to move to Spain in the 8th, 9th century and starting to move to Poland in the 11th, 12th century. We don't know. We know how we got there. We just don't know how the numbers got so big. And there's a lot of debates. And if you want any answers, please give me a call and I will tell you the exact same thing. I don't know. But it's a power base that is very different than what we've seen in previous areas. In the Sassanid Empire and the Caliphate in Spain, these were world powers that were the center of thriving commercial areas, thriving intellectual areas, thriving everything. And the Jews were living the life. We were in the middle of everything. In Poland, we were given a lot of leeway, but this was not the center of the intellectual universe. Poland was not. It was a nice place for Jews to live, but it wasn't New York. And it wasn't, Mesopotamia. It wasn't Spain. And as time went on and our numbers continued to grow, things would turn bad for us, but the power remained there simply because of all the people. There's so many people there that represent Judaism. It had to be the power place. We are not finding the most intellectual Jews, maybe in terms of Jewish study, but not outside Jewish study. In this area, study became limited to the Jewish world. They were studying Jewish stuff. The Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch, Midrash, all of these things. They weren't studying as much science and philosophy and math. This power in the Jewish world was because of the numbers and because of the excellence in Jewish literacy. It was also important to know that women were learned as well. They weren't necessarily always allowed to learn Hebrew, but they could read in Yiddish or whatever other languages. And you might say, well, that's really terrible. Well, you have to remember, at this period in time, most people in the world were not literate. A very tiny percentage of the world were literate, and almost no women in the world were literate at all. The only literate women you could really, even in the rising areas of Europe, even the queens and the dukes and the duchesses, they couldn't read either. There were certain ones that could, but all Jewish women could read and read well, and most of the time in many languages because you read Yiddish and because you had to do what other language. And this, of course, is where Yiddish was formed. It's kind of a conglomeration of German and a lot of other languages mixed together. But Jews are living in Poland and they're doing pretty well most of the time. Much better than Western Europe. A lot of Jews had not gone, probably didn't realize that things were not too bad or pretty good in the Ottoman Empire. But again, they were becoming more and more insulated, and that was only going to increase because eventually Poland is colonized. It is taken over. But before that, it takes over Ukraine, and we know how it all goes. But eventually, we know Poland is going to be taken over by Russia. And Russia is going to control a lot of this area. Now, we also know that anti-Semitism arises in a very big way in Ukraine. A lot of Jews are living in Ukraine. Poland had annexed Ukraine, so they'd taken over Ukraine, and they used Jews as their intermediaries. So there were Jews all over Ukraine who were tax collectors, rental collectors. They were running things for the Polish leadership. So this did not endear them to the Ukrainian population at all. They were not liked because, quite frankly, this is not an educated world. The Jewish world was educated, but outside, all I know is this guy is the guy who's taking my taxes. All I know is this guy is taking my farm if I can't pay him. All I know is this guy is forcing me to do these things I don't want to do. They don't realize that the people doing this are Jews who are representing others. The Jews were not in control of these areas. They were used as intermediaries, which made them, unfortunately, very easy scapegoats, because I'm going to attack the person I see. I'm not going to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to find a duke that I don't even know his name, or I can never find him, that has an army. And so what happened was disastrous. In 1648, a Ukrainian officer named Khmelnytsky, or Khmelnytsky, depending on how you pronounce it, raised an army of local peasants and brought in Russian Cossacks to attack Jews everywhere. And it became one of the worst Jewish massacres in history. Over a period of a year or two, they killed up to 200,000 Jews, probably more, all over, just going into small towns and shtetls and killing away. Now, obviously, things are going to get a little bit better, but we're going to be struggling after that. This is the time also of Shabtai Zvi, the man who claimed to be the Messiah. He turned out not to be the Messiah, but he got a big following, and no small, it was only a few years after this pogrom. That's why he became so famous. And so what we see is a lot of hate now, and it was only exasperated by this officer. And it's also going to create change, because Jews eventually are going to be more and more isolated when Poland is divided among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So in the 18th century, Poland basically ceases to exist, and these Jews end up being the property of Russia. And Russia, under Catherine the Great, who, by the way, physician may have been the nephew to the physician who was one of the founders of Mikveh Israel, by the way. That was, they move them, Russia moves them into one area, and that area, of course, is going to be called the Pale Settlement. And we'll see a map of the Pale Settlement right here. And these millions of Jews are going to be sent to this area, and mostly shtetls. 98% of the Jews living in these areas now will be in the shtetl. There'll be a small percentage living in Russia and other places, but you can see a lot of people are going to be living in these small little areas. Think Fiddler on the Roof. This is where it all begins. It doesn't begin 1,000 years ago. It begins at the end of the 18th century. And we're going to be sent there, and of course, our way of life is going to change, because it is nowhere near as good of a life as we had in Poland for those hundreds of years. And so when the masses are put into these areas, into these shtetls mostly, they are going to have very strict rules applied to them as to where they can go, where they can live, what they can do, who they can talk with. And it is going to be a very restraining year, and yet it still is a very important area. It's the center of the Jewish world still because of all the Jewish learning, the Jewish intelligentsia, the Jewish education that's going to come out of that area. Financially, it is not going to be a power. It's not going to be a power of science or of literature yet in the rest of the world, as it was in Spain. It is going to be just as studying the Talmud. So if you're in these areas with, Tevye, you study all the time you have free because that's all you do. And you study the Talmud and you study the Shulchan Aruch and you study only Jewish things. So you're very ignorant about the outside world, about math and science, but you're very, very literate, which is going to be essential. So the Pale Settlement, coined by Tsar Nicholas I, and Jews had to be registered, had to live in certain areas. But what's really interesting is that even though there were pogroms, even though there were terrible things happening, there was a lot of good that's going to come out of this in terms of educationally. What do I mean? What we're going to see is something called the Haskalah, named after my family, the Haskalah. If you believe me, please don't believe me, because that is not the truth. Ignore that completely. I feel guilty that I said it. It's not the Haskalah. It is the Haskalah. How's that? And what we're going to see coming is in the late 18th century, 1780s and 90s, this wonderful change in Europe, in Western Europe. We see the Renaissance. All of this coming starts to hit the Jewish world, but in a Jewish way. In Eastern Europe, we're not getting the sciences and the math and the technology, but we're getting a change in theology. This is where we get Hasidism. This is where we get that religious fervor that we're supposed to be really fervent about our Judaism and celebrating this. The Baal Shem Tov, when you see all these guys doing this is coming in the 17th, really in 18th, 19th centuries. We're going to see Yiddish literature start to take off in ways nobody could imagine because of this Haskalah. How do we know? Because a bunch of these guys get Nobel Prizes for literature. Think about Isaac Singer, Shalom Aleichem, Eyal Peretz, Chaim Bialik, Shalom Aish, David Pinsky, S.Y. Abramowitz, Shalom Yankev. These incredible authors, usually with short stories. Think about Tevye the Milkman. Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish theater starts to grow all over the place. And of course, it will eventually come to America. We're not going to talk about that yet. All of these wonderful things in a land that we are really struggling with in many ways. And not only that, Hebrew starts to make a comeback. Hebrew had always been a religious language, but it started in the 18th century and really the 19th century to become a language for modernity. And you were starting to get all of these great Hebrew poets who won Nobel Prizes, like Eyal Peretz and so many others. So you were getting Hebrew literature, you're getting Yiddish literature. And by the way, the people who wrote in Hebrew didn't always like people who wrote in Yiddish because they looked at Yiddish as kind of a lower class language. But it didn't matter because all of this is thriving in the women's world. The Chinuch is a women's language. Women would write their own prayers, their own stories. And it was just for women, which you think, oh my goodness, women were relegated to studying this. Yes, but nobody else the women in the rest of the world were not literate. Either were men. This is still only in the 19th and 18th century. All of this great change in education and the Enlightenment that hit Europe touches Eastern Europe. And whereas Moses Mendelssohn would fight for, the modernization of Jewish customs in Western and Central Europe. His grandson, of course, would be Felix Mendelssohn. In Eastern Europe, they're not fighting for equality. They're not fighting for a right to science or going to school yet. They are having their own enlightenment within the Jewish world. The Jewish stories, the Jewish discussions, all of this poetry and theater, and it is really quite beautiful and amazing that this happened in an area that, was very poor. Obviously, Russia, if you were in the cities in Russia, you have Dostoevsky and all these, whatever, brilliant. But in these poor areas that were completely cut off and they're living in shtetls, you saw these incredible things happening. And so the power base, again, is very different. So what do we see? We see, after the biblical era, a change in the power base of the Jewish world. And if you have any questions, anybody have any questions? If not, no worries. I'll just go over it again. We had Israel was the power base. Circa 200 to 300, it would move to the Sasanian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire, which is in Mesopotamia, which would become the Caliphate, and we did even better then. So our power stayed still in Mesopotamia, Tigris, and then it moved to Spain. When the Umayyad Caliphate moved to Spain, we moved with it, and that's where the power was. It would stay in Spain until we're kicked out, and then it would move to first Poland, and then when Poland was taken over, to the Pale Settlement. And in that area, our power was based solely on our Jewish liturgy, our Jewish discussions, the Talmud, Midrash, Mishnah, all of those discussions, nothing secular, as we would call it. And so that's how now what we're going to do next week is we have looked at the power of the Jewish world. We're going to look at some other places in the post-biblical era before we get to America and Israel. So next week, we're going to talk about the famous Khazars, if you haven't heard about them. One of the great myths, or wasn't a myth, the giant red-headed Jewish warriors. We're going to learn about how Jews were doing in places like Europe, where they were suffering a bit, in places like maybe China, or in places like Africa or India. So we'll do as much as we can and talk a little bit about how Jews were doing in areas that would not be considered the power of the Jewish world. So that'll be next week. So we're going to do one more session this month, and then we'll do 3 in November when we get to America, Israel, and Savannah. Any questions here? Online? Wow, no questions. I've answered them all. Yes, fantastic. So thank you for joining me on our second part. And we again will continue next week. If you have any questions or you want the maps, or I will have a timeline. The timeline I did was so long, I have to make it a little smaller. I don't think you want a timeline that's 132 pages. So we'll make it smaller, because last time the timeline was a little off. I realized there were some mistakes there. So all my best, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us, and have a great week.